I was standing under the ballroom lights when my father took the microphone and smiled the way he does when he wants the room on his side. The chandeliers at the Ritz-Carlton in San Francisco threw warm gold across linen tables and crystal glasses, and I could hear the low scrape of silverware and the soft laughter of people who felt important. 280 guests were there, board members, donors, reporters, friends of the company. My name was on the program as a courtesy, nothing more. Then he called me up. Not gently, not privately. He beckoned with 2 fingers, and the MC laughed to smooth it over. I felt the cold at the base of my neck before I felt anything else. When I reached the stage, my father did not hug me. He angled me toward the crowd like a prop and said, "Lane does not handle money well. She is emotional." There was a polite ripple of laughter, a few O's that pretended sympathy. He continued, "So we are putting the family fund in capable hands." He gestured toward my brother Evan in the front row and announced that the education and family trust that had carried my name since childhood would be managed by him effective immediately. He called it a practical decision, a responsible decision. I stood there while he joked about my lack of direction and thanked donors for their confidence. I heard the clink of a dropped fork and the whir of a camera shutter. I saw board members glance at one another the way people do when something has gone a step too far but no one wants to interrupt dessert. I did not cry. I did not speak. My hand tightened around the stem of my water glass, and my ears rang as if the room had tilted. I looked down and saw my mother Marianne avert her eyes and smooth her napkin, as if this were a weather change we all had to endure. My father finished by saying, "Do not make a scene," and the words landed like an order. That was the betrayal. Not private, not accidental, but public and clean and final. He had taken something that carried my name and handed it to my brother to prove a point about control. In 30 seconds, he turned my life into a lesson for his guests. I stepped back from the microphone, and the MC hurried in with a joke, and the band struck a note, and the room exhaled. I returned to my table and felt the burn settle into something steadier. I had learned young that arguments were useless in our house. Paper was not. As the applause faded, I felt the thin envelope in my clutch brush my wrist. It had been there all evening. I had not planned to use it tonight. I checked my phone under the table and saw a single line from Tessa, the estate administrator who always spoke plainly. "Documents ready." I locked the screen. My father raised his glass and toasted to leadership and discipline and family values. I remembered him saying years earlier that money was the only language people respected, and that respect was obedience. Around me, donors smiled and whispered, and the waiters poured wine. Inside my chest, something shifted from shock to clarity. The insult was not new. The setting was. I watched Evan bask in it, nodding like a man who had earned something rather than inherited a microphone. I thought of the years in Palo Alto when access to my own account required permission and signatures and patience. I thought of every calm remark that cut me down without raising a voice. The room felt smaller, as if the walls had inched closer to hear what would happen next. My father leaned toward me and murmured, "Not now, Lane. Be good." It was a command dressed as advice. I nodded because I always nod when I am counting. I counted breaths. I counted exits. I counted the cost of scenes and the cost of silence. Across the room, a reporter lifted a phone again, sensing blood in the water. I stood and excused myself, and the carpet swallowed my steps. In the hallway, the air was cooler, and the hum of the vents steadied my pulse. I did not need to argue. I had something better: contract signatures and a truth he could not buy. By the end of the night, he would learn that the building he wanted most, the one his firm had chased to save the quarter, was already mine. If you have ever been humiliated by family in public, stay with me, because what happened next was pure paperwork justice. Palo Alto in those years looked like safety to outsiders, a respectable suburb with trimmed hedges, quiet streets, and houses that whispered success instead of shouting it. Our house sat behind a low fence with a clean driveway and a flag that was always straight, and a kitchen that smelled like coffee and control. From 2013 to 2018, when I was a teenager moving toward college, my father, Richard Hale, ran our family. The way he ran his company, calmly publicly, reasonable, and privately absolute. He said money was protection, and protection required oversight. When my first checking account was opened, my name was on it, but the access was his. He explained it as safety and fraud prevention and good parenting. I nodded because nodding kept the peace. When I needed money for textbooks, he slid a single page across the counter and called it a budget agreement. It listed categories and limits and a signature line for me and another for him. He smiled as if this were a lesson in adulthood and not a leash. I signed because I wanted the books. At dinners with donors or friends, he would praise Evan for discipline and then look at me and say, Lane is creative, but she struggles with structure. The words were gentle, the effect was sharp. Laughter followed because the room trusted him. That was how control worked in our house. It never raised its voice, it documented. The escalation was gradual and deliberate. First, my allowance was reduced with a note about priorities. Then, my discretionary account was frozen after a purchase he deemed unnecessary. He sent an email copied to me and his assistant, explaining that oversight was part of leadership. I learned to save screenshots. The next step was larger. The 529 college plan that carried my name since childhood became a topic of discussion at the breakfast table. He said the company needed flexibility for a short period and that the funds would be returned. I asked how short. He said not to worry and added that Evan had agreed to help manage things responsibly. Weeks later, I found the statement showing a temporary transfer to a corporate public relations expense. It was framed as strategy. I stared at the numbers and felt something settle into place. Money was not support. It was leverage. When I mentioned it, he corrected me in front of my mother and said, Lane gets anxious about finances and sometimes confuses statements. Marianne nodded and said, Your father does this because he loves you. That sentence did more damage than the transfer. By senior year, the pattern hardened. Small cuts became larger withdrawals. Requests required approvals that arrived late or not at all. Each conversation ended with a reminder that the family trust existed at his discretion. He never said threat. He said consequence. If I pushed, he said we can revisit your place in the trust, and the room would go quiet. I learned to stop pushing. I learned to record dates, amounts, and words. I kept emails, bank alerts, receipts, anything that turned air into paper. I learned that calm criticism in public carried more force than anger in private. I watched Evan receive shares as loyalty rewards and listened, as my father called it, merit. I understood then that money was the language and silence was the grammar. The final lesson came in an email sent late one night titled Transfer Authorization. It was brief and confident, approving a movement of funds with his signature clean and final. I took a photo and saved it twice. That was the night I understood money was a chain and paper was the key. By the time I entered college, the pattern had settled into routine, and routine made it easier for others to miss what was happening. Family dinners followed the same script whether it was a holiday or an ordinary Sunday in Palo Alto. My father would raise his glass and introduce Evan first as the future of the company, the reliable one, the steady hand. Then he would turn to me and add my name like a footnote and say, She is smart, but not business smart, and smile as if the distinction were generous. People laughed because the tone invited laughter. At fundraisers, the order never changed. Evan shook hands and accepted compliments while I stood half a step behind holding a coat or a program. When someone asked what I did, my father answered for me and kept it vague. She is figuring things out. The insult was never loud. It was calibrated to sound reasonable to people who already trusted him. The escalation was systematic. Evan began receiving small blocks of shares tied to loyalty and presence. My father called them incentives and explained that leadership required commitment. I watched documents arrive by courier with Evan's name on them and a ribbon that signaled importance. When I asked whether I would receive the same consideration, my father said rewards follow contribution, and then asked whether I had finished my budget report. At Christmas, a lawyer joined us for dessert and slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside was a non-disclosure agreement covering family financial matters. The language was clean and corporate and presented as protection. My father said it was standard and that signing would show maturity. I signed because refusal would be interpreted as instability, and instability had a price. The unfairness grew teeth when paperwork began to enforce it. Evan's equity was recorded and celebrated. My silence was documented and required. At a charity gala, my father introduced Evan as the partner he trusted and added that I preferred creative pursuits. Someone patted my arm. I felt the heat rise and let it pass. I had learned that contradiction only sharpened his control. The value points were always small and frequent, like reminders tapped into the day. An email copying his assistant, noting that my expense reimbursement was delayed pending review. A calendar invite for Evan titled Leadership Briefing, while mine read optional. A comment made lightly that I worried too much about details. Each piece told the same story in a language the room understood. My mother repeated that your father knows best, and that families need harmony. I saw how harmony was achieved, through signatures and seating charts and who was allowed to speak. I stopped trying to correct the narrative and started collecting it. I saved the NDA. I noted the dates of Evan's share awards and the justifications attached. I tracked the moments when my name was used to decorate decisions I did not make. The anger came and went, but something steadier replaced it. A resolve that did not need an audience. At another fundraiser, I stood near the registration table and watched my father guide Evan to a board member with a hand on his shoulder. When the board member asked about me, my father said she is talented, but she needs time. I nodded and thanked them for coming. The injustice was no longer abstract. It was organized. I decided then that I would not win by arguing about feelings. I would win by understanding the rules better than the people using them. The night I met Tessa was unremarkable to everyone else. She was introduced as an estate administrator helping a donor with paperwork. She spoke plainly and asked precise questions. When she learned my last name, she looked at me a moment longer than polite and then said quietly, "Do you know what is actually in your name?" I left Palo Alto for San Jose with a notebook and a habit of listening more than I spoke. In Santa Clara County, nobody cared who my father was, and that anonymity felt like oxygen. I worked as a zoning consultant focused on permit strategy, the unglamorous work that determines whether a project lives or dies before concrete is poured. My days were spent reading maps that most people ignored, understanding land use codes and entitlement pathways that turn a maybe into an approval. I learned which corridors could support mixed use and which parcels hid restrictions and footnotes. At county offices, I waited in the same lines as everyone else and watched how patience moved faster than force. I knew which forms triggered reviews and which conversations shortened them. That was where quiet excellence mattered. I did not announce results. I delivered them. I could read a zoning variance request and tell you where it would stall. I could look at property tax history and predict a challenge before it arrived. When I needed clarity, I called a planner by name and asked a narrow question. He answered because specificity earns respect. I never mentioned my family. I let the work speak in small confirmations, an email approving a permit ahead of schedule, a correction to a site plan that saved months. Clients noticed and told others. The signals of power were subtle and easy to miss. A message that read escrow confirmed arrived while I was reviewing an entitlement memo. I glanced at it and locked the screen. There was no reason to share that moment. The better I became, the more careful I grew. I had seen how credit could be claimed and authority rerouted. So I hid the edges of my capability. At meetings, I asked questions instead of offering conclusions. I let partners present results I had structured. I watched how ownership moved through paper and how silence preserved it. Every few weeks, there was a value point that grounded the work for people who liked things to make sense. A permit approval number that unlocked a lender requirement. A zoning variance that allowed an extra floor without changing footprint. A property tax reassessment avoided by timing a filing. These were not tricks. They were rules followed precisely. At night, I organized documents the way my father organized people. with labels and dates and clear lines of authority. When Tessa reached out again, it was not dramatic. She asked whether I could review a beneficiary update for a trust tied to a holding structure. The language was plain. The responsibility was real. We met at a coffee shop near downtown San Jose, and she explained the change without embellishment. I signed after reading every line and slid the folder back to her. No one at home knew. That was the point. The building entered my life quietly, the way real power often does. It began with a tenant meeting in downtown San Jose held in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. I took a seat near the back and listened as property managers reviewed occupancy charts and maintenance schedules. On the wall, a simple plaque carried the building name, and nothing else. I watched the numbers instead. Current occupancy sat in the high 90s with long-term leases weighted towards stable tenants. Renewal options were structured conservatively, and that discipline showed in the cash flow. I asked a question about common area upgrades and how they would affect lease extensions. The room turned toward me, and the manager answered with specifics because specifics invite respect. I wrote notes and kept my face neutral. I never said the word own. I reviewed reports that afternoon and checked the net operating income against projections. The range supported a valuation that would make headlines if anyone shouted it, but shouting was unnecessary. The asset sat inside a holding structure designed to do one thing well, which was to protect continuity. I was the controlling beneficiary on paper and invisible in practice. That balance mattered. I walked the block later and watched foot traffic at lunch, noting where it slowed and why. Lease terms were staggered to avoid cliffs, and the escrow timeline had been planned months ahead to absorb market noise. These details were not secrets. They were just ignored by people who preferred drama to diligence. The escalation came from elsewhere. My father began talking about San Jose more often at dinners and in passing comments. He mentioned opportunities and the need to stabilize a quarter. He praised Evan for his instincts and hinted at a landmark deal that would reset perception. I said nothing. I checked emails and calendars and noticed how often the same address appeared in his conversations. I attended another tenant meeting and confirmed that nothing had changed except interest. Numbers stayed strong. NOI held. The valuation range tightened as rates shifted. Escrow remained on schedule. Then the email arrived without ceremony. Your father's firm is bidding on the asset. I read it once and closed my laptop. The pressure arrived dressed as opportunity, which was how my father preferred it. He called me into his study and spoke about quarters and optics and how markets respond to confidence. The building in San Jose had become a fixation because it promised a clean headline and a reset he needed. He said the firm had to save the quarter and that the deal would signal strength. He praised Evan for lining up meetings and then turned to me with a smile that asked for compliance. He wanted me to be the PR daughter to stand beside him and sign a letter of support for the project, a simple endorsement to reassure partners. He said it would look good and keep the family aligned. When I hesitated, he added that trust decisions require unity, and that disunity complicates governance. The threat was polite and precise. Sign or risk your place. I asked him to send everything by email. He agreed, because paper comforts people who believe they control it. The escalation tightened. He forwarded a draft letter with language about stewardship and values and asked me to return it signed by end of day. I replied with questions and copied only myself. He called to hurry me and reminded me that family trusts are privileges, not rights. I listened and asked him to confirm that in writing. He did not, but his assistant did by scheduling a meeting titled Trust Alignment. I asked Tessa for copies of the trust statements, and she sent them with dates and balances highlighted. I read them slowly. I requested that all requests come by email and that any meeting minutes be recorded. He agreed again, because he thought speed was on his side. I asked for clarity about the education fund and the timing of prior transfers. He replied with a sentence about temporary measures and leadership discretion. I saved it. The assistant caught me in the hallway and whispered that she had heard him order another withdrawal framed as PR necessity. I asked her to write a note of what she heard and the time. She did. The value points accumulated like tiles, an email approving use of funds, a meeting minute noting urgency, a calendar invite labeled emergency optics. None of it dramatic, all of it usable. When I refused to sign the letter, he escalated to tone. He said I owed the family, and that resistance would force him to revisit names on documents. I asked him to clarify whether he meant removal from the trust. He paused, and then said we can discuss consequences later. I followed with an email summarizing the conversation and asked him to correct anything inaccurate. He did not respond. Due diligence moved forward without me. Then the update arrived that shifted the air. The team flagged an issue because the controlling party refused to disclose. My father was furious and needed leverage. He needed me. We were back in the same ballroom, and everything moved faster, as if the room itself remembered what had happened earlier and wanted resolution. Lights felt brighter, voices sharper, time compressed. I took my seat and kept my hand still. My father stood near the stage, smiling too quickly, greeting people he needed to see him calm. The MC began again and tried to regain rhythm. The deal had reached its final gate, and law required clarity before signatures could touch paper. No speeches, no drama, just verification. The attorney stepped forward with a folder and spoke in the neutral cadence of someone paid to be precise. Before execution, we need confirmation of the controlling party. It was routine. It was mandatory. It was not my choice. Tessa stood to one side with her tablet, open, eyes steady. The attorney read the line everyone needed to hear and nothing else. The controlling interest is held by Lane. For a beat, the room did not understand. Then a glass slipped from a hand and shattered softly against the carpeted floor. Someone whispered, "Did he say Lane?" Another voice said, "Impossible." My father laughed once too loud and lifted his hands, as if this were a misunderstanding easily fixed. He said there must be confusion, and that family structures can be complex. The board members did not laugh. They leaned back and studied him differently. A reporter raised a camera and the flash cut the air. An assistant closed a laptop and stopped typing. The MC glanced at the band and then back at the attorney, unsure which cue applied. Tessa confirmed with dates and filings, and the attorney nodded because confirmation was complete. The room recalibrated around that fact. My father tried to continue speaking and found that the room had moved on. He smiled again, and it did not land. He asked for a moment, and the attorney said we can proceed once disclosures are satisfied. That was it. No applause, no condemnation, just consequence. I felt my pulse steady. This was not a reveal made to impress. It was a disclosure required to proceed. The escalation came in faces. People who had nodded earlier now watched him like a problem to be solved. The press angled for reaction and captured the instant his confidence broke. He stepped toward me and lowered his voice and asked us to talk privately. He put a hand on my elbow and steered me toward the service corridor behind the stage. The hallway hummed with vents and carts and the smell of coffee. He stopped and said, "You did this on purpose." I said nothing. He said, "You embarrassed me." I said, "The paperwork spoke." He said, "You owe this family." I said, "Accountability comes first." His voice sharpened, and he promised consequences, and said he could still fix this. I asked him to put that in writing. He froze. That was when I understood the mic had been kinder than the hallway. Pause for a second, because what he said to me off stage was worse than anything he said on the mic. The hallway behind the ballroom felt like a different world from the polished stage. The air was cooler and smelled of disinfectant and brewed coffee. A vending machine buzzed softly. Somewhere a cart rolled and a door clicked shut. The hotel staff moved past us without looking up because they had seen every kind of family drama and knew to keep walking. My father stopped under a ceiling vent, and the hum of the air conditioning filled the silence between his words. He leaned in close enough that I could smell the mint on his breath and the sharp cologne he wore when he wanted to dominate a room. His voice was low and controlled, as if he were explaining policy, not threatening his daughter. You owe this family. He said it like a fact, written into law. I felt my heart hammer once hard against my ribs and then settle into a steady beat. I kept my face neutral and listened. He continued with the tone he used in board meetings when he expected compliance. Fix this or I will ruin you. The words landed clean and cold, not a shout, not a scene, a promise. I noticed how he chose the word ruin because it covered everything reputation access work relationships. It was coercion dressed as inevitability. I breathed in through my nose and kept my hand still. I had learned long ago that the moment you look afraid is the moment he believes he owns you. He began gaslighting immediately. He said the attorney misspoke. He said the documents were misfiled. He said I must have been manipulated by someone and that I did not understand what I had signed. He said my emotions were making me reckless and reminded me that everyone already thinks I am unstable with money. I watched his mouth form the same story he had used for years, and I realized he was not speaking to me. He was rehearsing the version he would tell the board if he needed to. I answered calmly and without heat. I said the disclosure was required. I said the paperwork was accurate. He smiled in a way that never reached his eyes and said, "You are forcing my hand." The escalation moved from insult to procedure. He said he would have his lawyer challenge the structure. He said he could seek control and that family trusts are flexible when the family leader acts. He said I would be removed and that my name could be changed on documents the way he changed narratives in rooms full of people. My pulse quickened, and I felt the heat rise behind my ears, but I kept my voice even. I said, I am not discussing this without counsel present. He scoffed and called me ungrateful. He said, "Do you know what it took to build what you are enjoying?" He said Evan has earned his place. He said I was trying to destroy the family. I watched him do what he always did when faced with evidence. He turned it into morality. I let him finish, and then I took the thin envelope from my clutch and removed a single page. I did not show him everything. I showed only what mattered. I pointed to the line and said, "You already signed away that option." For the first time, his expression shifted. Not fear, exactly, but calculation interrupted. He reached for the page and I held it just out of reach. I could see him measuring whether to grab it, whether to threaten louder, whether to bargain. He chose a softer voice and said, "We can work this out privately." I said no. I said any further communication should be in writing. He looked past me toward the corridor, as if he needed a witness who would agree with him. There was none. I turned and walked away before he could regain the advantage. In the elevator, I opened my phone and drafted an email while my hand still shook slightly. I summarized his statements and my response. I attached nothing yet. I copied the board attorney and the deal attorney and wrote 2 words that made everything real for clarity. The consequences did not arrive with sirens or shouting. They arrived the way real consequences do through calendars, inboxes, and quiet changes in who returns your calls. The morning after the gala, my phone filled with requests framed as updates. A board member wanted clarification. The deal attorney wanted documentation. An internal counsel assistant scheduled a meeting titled Review. By noon, the board had opened an internal review, and the phrase they used was clinical misuse of family funds. They were not investigating feelings. They were investigating transactions. I sat at my kitchen table in San Jose and laid out the evidence the way I would lay out a permit packet in Santa Clara County. Clear date stamped and easy to follow. The first number was $26,412, moved from the 529 account on May 14, 2016, coded as public relations support. The second was $18,900 on September 3, 2017, listed as event optics. I had statements. I had the transfer authorization email with my father's signature. I had the note from his assistant describing the order to pull from education funds again and the time she heard it. Each document was a step. Each step removed the ability to deny. The board asked for context, and I provided only what was necessary. I did not call my father names. I did not describe my childhood. I showed a pattern, dates, amounts, and the language he used to justify them. Within days, the story moved from private review to public risk. A reporter obtained a copy of the review agenda, and the headline that followed was not about my humiliation. It was about money. Family Education Fund used for corporate PR board reviews oversight. The numbers were small compared to the company, but the optics were lethal because they revealed character. My father had built his reputation on responsibility, and now responsibility had a ledger. Evan tried to step forward as the solution. He offered to manage communications and act as liaison. That was when his lack of competence became obvious. In a call with attorneys, he confused basic terms and asked questions that showed he had never read the documents he was supposed to oversee. He repeated my father's talking points and stumbled when asked for specifics. A board member asked him to explain why a trust statement listed discretionary transfers without beneficiary consent. Evan said he would get back to them, and the silence that followed was heavy. He had been a symbol, not a leader. The review exposed that too. Another number surfaced in the packet, a withdrawal of $65,000 on February 12, 2018, from an estate account used to cover a fundraiser deficit tied to my father's image. The board noted it. The attorney asked whether approvals existed. My father's counsel tried to frame it as family discretion. The board answered with governance. Meanwhile, my father's friends stopped returning calls. A donor postponed a pledge. A partner asked to reschedule a meeting indefinitely. Reputation began to crack not from one scandal, but from the realization that he had treated family funds as a private wallet while preaching discipline. I watched it unfold with a steady stomach and a tired heart. Part of me wanted to scream at the unfairness of how easy it had been for him to do this for years. Instead, I stayed quiet and let the paper speak. The evidence did not need emotion. It needed structure. Then my mother called. Her voice broke before she said my name. She was crying, and I could hear the clink of dishes in the background, as if she were pacing in our old kitchen. She begged me not to make this a war. She said your father is under so much pressure. She said people are talking. She said please do not make it a big thing. I closed my eyes and listened. Even in tears, she was asking me to protect the system that had hurt me. 2 weeks after the gala, my father called me from a number I did not recognize. When I answered, his tone was different, smoother, almost warm, as if we were catching up after a normal family dinner. He said, "Lane, I am proud of you." The words should have landed like balm, but they slid off me because I knew the timing. Pride was not new to him. It was a tool he used when threats stopped working. He continued by saying, "I have always known you were capable," and that he had pushed me to make me stronger. He said he respected how I handled pressure. Then he pivoted to what he actually wanted. He said the deal is sensitive, and the board is overreacting, and if I would just clarify a few things publicly, the whole situation could settle. He said I could help save the quarter and protect the family name. He said, "You do not want Evan to suffer for a misunderstanding." The message was clear. He wanted me to become the cover. He wanted me to sign a statement that framed the education fund transfers as authorized family strategy. He wanted me to make the story boring, so it would disappear. I let him finish and answered in the same tone I use with county clerks when I need a permit processed correctly. Accountability first. There was a pause, and I could hear his breath tighten. He tried again. He said we can fix this privately and that public conflict benefits no one. He said, "We are family." I did not argue about family. I said the board review was appropriate and that documentation should stand on its own. His warmth cooled and he moved to bargaining. He offered me equity. He said he could transfer shares to my name and increase my discretionary distributions. He mentioned money as if it were apology. He suggested an account in my control. He said we can make you whole and you can stop the bleeding. The offer was designed to sound generous to anyone who had not lived in my house. To me, it sounded like hush money wrapped in parental concern. I told him no. I said I am not negotiating for silence. He accused me of greed, which almost made me laugh because greed was the accusation he always used when he was the one trying to buy outcomes. I stayed steady and said, I have a compliance trail. That phrase changed the air. He asked what I meant. I said every request he made was documented. Every transfer was dated. Every threat was summarized in writing. I said I was not interested in revenge. I was interested in fairness and prevention. He said, You are destroying me. I said, You made choices, and now those choices have consequences. He tried to reframe again and said he had protected me my whole life. I said protection does not require humiliation. He said, You do not understand how the world works. I said, I understand exactly how it works, and that is why I am not signing anything. His voice sharpened, and he warned that I would regret this. I did not respond. I ended the call and sat still for a moment, letting the quiet return to my apartment. The anger was there, but it was not driving me. Something cleaner was, a boundary that did not move. I opened my laptop and reviewed the packet Tessa had prepared. The trust statements were already organized, and the emails were already indexed. The assistant note was time-stamped. The board attorney had already asked for a formal record. My father thought this was about emotion and ego. It was about governance and paper, and the fact that he could not undo what had been recorded. I did not want his money or his shares. I wanted him to stop using money as a weapon against people who depended on him. That required sunlight. I drafted the final step carefully, a formal filing request and an audit trigger that would force the review into an official process with deadlines and accountability. I attached the key documents and wrote one sentence that closed the door. Please initiate a formal audit and preserve all records effective immediately. The final break did not feel like victory. At first, it felt like a series of ordinary appointments stacked back to back on a quiet calendar. I started the morning at a law office with neutral walls and framed certificates where the work moved at the speed of signatures. Tessa laid out the documents in a neat order and explained each step without ceremony. Restitution of the education fund came first because it was the simplest to correct. The amounts were listed with dates and references, and the return was processed through a bank transfer that left a clean trail. I watched the numbers move back where they belonged and felt a pressure I had carried for years loosen slightly. Next came the estate portion that had been withheld under discretion language. The amendment clarified my share and removed the ambiguity that had been used to control me. I read every clause and signed with a steady hand, while a notary verified identity and stamped the page. At the bank, a manager confirmed receipt and asked whether I wanted notifications set. I said yes, and chose the most transparent option. Control of the shares came last and required more steps because opacity had been the point. The filings corrected ownership records and reflected authority that had existed on paper but not in practice. When the confirmation arrived, I did not smile. I felt quiet. In the afternoon, the consequences reached my father in the only language he had respected. The board meeting was brief and procedural. They cited governance failures and misuse of family funds and the risk to the company. The chair role changed hands, and the title he had worn for decades was removed with outraised voices. There was no spectacle and no punishment beyond removal from power. He did not go to prison, and no one cheered. The company stabilized because institutions prefer continuity over drama. I received the notice while sitting in a conference room waiting for the last stamp. It confirmed what had already happened. The control he used to exert through money and titles no longer reached me. I finished the day at the bank signing routine forms and setting access limits that reflected reality instead of fear. When I left the building, the sun was lower, and the sidewalk was busy with people who did not know my name or my history. I stood there for a moment and breathed. The days after the filings were quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. I went back to my routine without announcing anything to anyone who did not need to know. Mornings began with coffee at the same place near my apartment, where the barista remembered my order and asked about the weather instead of my family. I read the paper and watched people move through ordinary lives and felt the relief of not being watched. At work, I returned to zoning memos and permit timelines and the satisfaction of a clean approval. Clients cared about results, not names, and that suited me. When I met a friend for lunch, we talked about small things and laughed, and I noticed how easy it was to be present when there was nothing to defend. Power had not changed my voice or my schedule. It had removed the noise. The calm surprised me because I had expected anger to linger. Instead, there was space. I realized that real authority shows up as steadiness. I did not check accounts obsessively or rehearse conversations. I trusted the systems I had put in place because they were designed to work without me. One afternoon, I visited a community college to meet a counselor about a small education fund I had set up quietly. It was modest and specific, focused on books and fees for students who fell between assistance programs. I listened to their needs and agreed on simple criteria. There was no ceremony and no plaque. I signed the paperwork and asked for reports once a year. It felt right because it was practical and because it turned my lesson into something useful. Paperwork is protection. That truth had saved me, and now it could help someone else without requiring gratitude. In the evenings, I walked and cooked and slept without bracing for interruption. The phone rang less, and when it did, I chose whether to answer. I noticed how my body learned to relax. Shoulders dropped, breathing slowed. The absence of fear was not dramatic. It was gentle. Then, a letter arrived in an envelope with my father's handwriting. It was a handwritten apology that asked for understanding and hinted at regret. I held it for a moment and set it down unopened, knowing that peace does not require permission. I did not rush to respond to my father's letter, because urgency was no longer my language. Days passed, and the consequences settled into their proper places. He lived with what he had lost, and there was no dramatic redemption arc waiting for him. Just quieter rooms, fewer calls, and a reputation reshaped by facts instead of applause. When he reached out again through intermediaries asking for a meeting, I declined without anger and without explanation. Boundaries do not require speeches. They require consistency. I did not hate him, and I did not forgive him on demand. I chose distance because distance is sometimes the only form of respect left. My life moved forward in small, practical ways. Work continued. The building ran on schedules and leases, and the ordinary discipline that keeps values stable. Friends came by and asked careful questions, and I answered only what was necessary. I learned that privacy is not secrecy. It is stewardship. Looking back, I could see how control had been disguised as care, and how love had been presented as leverage. The lesson was not bitter. It was clarifying. Respect without fear is not a slogan, it is a standard. When fear enters the room, respect leaves. Truth does not need volume because paper carries it farther than voices ever could. I did not win by shouting or humiliating anyone. I won by refusing to participate in a system that required my silence to function. The aftermath had weight, and that was appropriate. Systems change when incentives change, and when records exist to support change. That is the part people skip when they want a quick ending. There was no parade and no public apology that fixed everything. There was accountability in time, and the steady work of living differently. If you have lived through control disguised as love, tell me, what did you do to break free? And if this story resonated, I have two more you might want to watch. Next one about a quiet audit that reclaimed an inheritance, and another about a trust corrected after years of pressure. Both are about money and boundaries, and the long arc of justice when paperwork finally speaks.